we all kind of live in the same area, experience the same things. We have kind of the same things coming to us across television and through our devices. But Christmas is often sold to us as a season where everything slows down, which is not true, softens, which is also not true, and feels safe, which may be true and probably not in most cases. But Jesus ends the Beatitudes by doing the exact opposite. He presses the idea of the good life to its complete breaking point. When he ends this short part of this bigger sermon that he gives, he says, "Blessed are the persecuted." He says that to tie human flourishing, we're not to tie it to comfort, approval, or stability, but ultimately we're to tie our flourishing to allegiance to God's kingdom. And that may be shocking to hear at Christmas. We expect joy and not conflict, peace and not resistance. Yet from the moment that Jesus enters the world, his presence unsettles power, exposes false loyalties, and it provokes fear in those who depend on power to support their life. Christmas is a story Christmas is not about God arriving to make life cozy. It's about God drawing near to redeem everything. And what we discover in the story of the Gospels in the early church is that when the kingdom draws near, something always has to give way. And so this morning, just from Matthew 5, 10 through 12, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things about you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward in heaven is great, for they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way. Boy, that would go great on a billboard to say, "Come join our movement." Jesus ends the Beatitudes in the place that none of us probably would have chosen to do that. Up to this point, his vision of the good life, it sounds challenging, but it still sounds manageable, right? Something we can do. But they still sound like they might work in a world where we live. They sound like the kind of virtues that make your life better, healthier, or even more grounded. But then Jesus says in the closing of this, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness." And as you can imagine, in rooms everywhere where that's been spoken over the last 2,000 years, things may get radically quiet at that point. Because oftentimes persecution doesn't sound like self-improvement. Because persecution does sound an awful lot like loss. Loss of approval, loss of belonging, loss of status, loss of safety. And suddenly the good life doesn't sound very good anymore, at least by most of our standards. Because oftentimes we've been formed by a different story. Our culture tells us the good life is found through validation. Find your people, find your place, find the space where you're affirmed, celebrated, and protected from discomfort. And if one group doesn't validate you, find the one that will, right? Move on. But not only what Jesus tells here, but his whole life story points to a different understanding. The good life isn't found in validation. It's found in allegiance. And allegiance will always create friction in a world that's divided. Christmas reveals this to us, that God's kingdom threatens every false authority, not because God is hostile to authority itself, but because his kingdom exposes authority that has forgotten its limits. When Jesus is born, nothing is overthrown by force, yet everything is put on notice. In the Christmas story, we read about Herod, how he panics, not because this child is somehow violent, but because a rival allegiance has entered into the world and he knows it. Rome will eventually respond for the same reason, and wherever power depends on fear, control, or self-preservation, the presence of God becomes very unsettling to those places. Christmas doesn't declare chaos, but it declares a rightful order of the world and how things ought to be. It reveals that no throne or system or identity gets to be forced onto people or by coercion, but that's all claimed by truth, humility, and the sacrificial love that Jesus demonstrates. That's why Christmas is both the good news to many and a threat to many as well. It comforts the humble, and yet it still confronts every power that pretends it can rule without God. Christmas reveals this: God's kingdom threatens every false authority that we set up in our lives. And when we think about Christmas, let's be honest, persecution isn't on the top of our list, right? Our imagination has been trained and carefully, relentlessly throughout the years, and Christmas has become, in our cultural imagination, a cozy, safe, and sentimental space. All the money always gets given away at the end of the movie, right? Christmas is warm lights, familiar songs, and manageable problems. And oftentimes it's emotional resolution in 90 minutes. Turn on the Hallmark Channel and you'll find that out pretty quick. You can be the weirdest, most adverse person that moves into town and you find love by the end of the story and everything's good. And you may even see Travis Kelce's mom in one of those movies. That's one of my favorite ones. Anyways, Hallmark has taught us well. But the actual Christmas story that we read about in the Gospels is very disruptive from the very first moment. You see Mary, she carries a pregnancy that puts her reputation completely at risk. Joseph absorbs shame to stay faithful. Jesus is born under an empire that will soon try to kill him, and within months his family becomes refugees fleeing the state's violence for somewhere else. Before there are angels and shepherds, there's fear, and before there's worship, there's danger, and before there's joy, there is upheaval. Christmas is not God showing up to make people comfortable. Christmas is God showing up to change things. And change never happens at a distance. Christmas reveals this, is that God's kingdom threatens every false authority in our life. Because Christmas is not the exception to persecution, it becomes the prototype for what it looks like. What Jesus says is remarkably clear. He doesn't say to the people there that day, the good life is for you when life gets hard. He doesn't say, blessed are you when people misunderstand you. He doesn't say, blessed are those who are, he does say this though. Skip those two. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. And he also says, because of me. Those words matter. Persecution is not random cruelty. It's not an inconvenience. And it's not people being rude online. Persecution happens, though, when righteousness, when Jesus, when the embodiment of what God calls the good life disrupts the systems in our world. Jesus will immediately anchor this in his history. He'll say, for they persecuted the prophets who were before you. If you read the Old Testament, you find out it doesn't take long to figure out which ones were and which ones weren't. The prophets weren't persecuted because they were unpleasant people, although they may have had interesting styles at the time and diets. But they were persecuted because they told the truth, even when it threatened the people around them. Jeremiah told the truth about a corrupt religious system, and he was thrown into a pit. Elijah confronted political idolatry, and he was run out of town. Price put on his head. Because the truth is that truth doesn't threaten people who have nothing to lose. It threatens people who do have something to lose. And that's the clarity that Jesus gives us. Persecution does not appear out of nowhere, though. It does have a catalyst, a starting point, something that sets it off. It shows up whenever the kingdom of God draws near and begins to reorder loyalties of people. This is why the Christmas story immediately turns. When the wise men or the magi, these foreign dignitaries come to Jesus, they come to Herod first, and they begin to ask, "Where's the one who's born King of the Jews?" Can you imagine being like a governor over a province, a ruler over an area that you're supposed to keep political, like settling to, where people are not supposed to rise up and take power, where you're supposed to be the one in control, and you have these foreigners coming and they say, "Where is the actual king?" And you think, "Oh no, this is not good news for me right now. I'm supposed to be the king. I'm not supposed to let this happen." And in that story, Herod doesn't blow it off. He doesn't shrug. He doesn't say, "Well, that was nice." He panics. He worries. Because Herod understands what that question implies to not only his life, but the threat to the kingdom there. Herod understands that this isn't a cute birth announcement, but that it's a challenge to his authority. And to be honest, Herod's not afraid of babies, as you read in Matthew 4:2. He's afraid of a rival king who would rise up and take power from him. You see, Herod operates on a system where his power is borrowed from Rome. His throne is held together by violence and fear, and the announcement of a new king destabilizes everything that night. That's why we read about children dying in Bethlehem. That's not just a simple sentimental detail that's there that day. That's a warning. That God coming into the world, that Emmanuel, God with us, being present in a broken world, is not just a simple fact that can be dismissed. Because it announces that authority is being redefined. And the same pattern appears at the end of Jesus' life. Rome doesn't crucify Jesus because he heals people, right? They weren't like, "Well, darn it, Jesus healed somebody again. We better get rid of him." They don't crucify him because he teaches about love. They don't really, that doesn't seem to bother them. They crucify him, though, because he claims authority. The sign above his head that day when he was crucified doesn't say teacher or miracle worker or anything of the sorts. Reads very clearly that day and recorded throughout history, King of the Jews. And from the beginning of this story to the end, it's consistent. Jesus isn't killed because he's harmless. He's killed because he's uncontrollable. And this is the scandal of Christmas. A God with us cannot be managed. You see, oftentimes we put God in a picture, and I've got to stay close to this thing, sorry. We put God in a picture where he's distant and safe, and he's over there, and we're over here, and life is good, and that is fine, and we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want, doesn't matter. And God becomes this safe, kind of detached, disembodied, otherworldly thing that we can look at and say, okay, that's nice, but here's real life. We often over-spiritualize and mysticize most of the New Testament and even the thought of Jesus to where Jesus is distant and safe, and he's useful for the things we need him for. We even go so far as at times to make God private, where it's just a privatized thing. We talked about this a few weeks ago, where God becomes awfully convenient because he doesn't have to intersect with our everyday and ordinary lives. But when Jesus takes on flesh, like when Jesus steps into history and time and space, when he speaks truth publicly, when he calls people to reorder their lives, when he demands allegiance to him alone, that's the kind of God that provokes resistance from people. And Christmas reveals this. God's kingdom threatens every false authority in our life. Christmas is not God entering the world politely. It's God entering the world definitively. And here's something that Jesus makes painfully clear, and it matters. In the story of the Gospels, the story about Jesus' life, the historical attestation we have of him, the firsthand accounts, the recording of all that, what we discover when we read those stories is that prostitutes don't persecute Jesus. The lepers, they don't persecute Jesus. The demon-possessed, they don't persecute Jesus. The poor, they don't persecute Jesus. Because they understand their brokenness and they don't attack Jesus, but they recognize him. What Jesus points to and what the stories of the gospel points to is that resistance always comes from somewhere else. From people with authority, with certainty, people who benefit from the way things already work. And in Matthew 23, Jesus names this clearly. In talking to a group of religious leaders that day that were opposed to Jesus, that knew if he was really who he said he was, things would not go well for them, that they had to change in order to be the people that he called them to be. He says this in Matthew 23. Woe to you, experts in the law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous and say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have participated with them in the shedding of the prophets' blood. By saying this, you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up the measure of your ancestors, you snakes, you offsprings of vipers. How will you escape being condemned to hell? For this reason I am sending to you prophets and wise men and experts in the law, some of whom you will kill and you will crucify. And some of them you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that on you will come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the righteous blood of Abel to that of Zacharias and of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, this generation will be held responsible for all of these things. In other words, you honor the prophets now because they're dead, but you would have opposed them while they were still alive. If we had to rate comfort on a scale of 1 to 10 in the room that day, we would have been about a 15. Because Jesus that day isn't accusing them of cruelty, although it did take place, but he's accusing them of self-protection. In John 7, Jesus explains this clearly when he says this, the world cannot hate you because it hates me, because I testify about it, that its deeds are evil. That's not insignificant for John to include that day. Jesus is not hated because he lacks compassion. He's hated because he tells the truth. But truth is not dangerous to people with nothing to lose. And truth is dangerous, though, to those who do. Jesus will turn to his disciples and say, if they persecuted you, or if they persecute me, they will also persecute you. Not if, not maybe, but when. Because the pattern doesn't change. Persecution doesn't come from chaos. It comes from a system that's being questioned. It comes from systems, both religious, political, cultural, that feel threatened by the righteousness that they cannot manage when they feel threatened by Jesus himself. Because Christmas reveals this: God's kingdom threatens every false authority. And that's not pessimism, that's just describing the way things are. And we'll talk about this more in depth next week, but Jesus doesn't stop with the Beatitudes. He immediately says this: you're the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth. Those aren't intended to be gentle metaphors, because light doesn't negotiate with darkness. Don't know if you ever noticed that or not. You turn a light on in a dark room, there's not a battle of power there. Because light reveals. And if you've had the experience of making salt dough cookies over the last few weeks, and you have these nice little winter cracks on your hands, from dry weather and washing your hands like you should be, and then it bleeds, it's all this crazy stuff, you'll notice that salt doesn't blend in quickly, especially in those situations. Because it often preserves and it often exposes decay. Light's not opposed because it's offensive. It's opposed because it makes things visible. Salt's not resisted because it's aggressive. Because it is Salt is resisted not because it's aggressive, but because it interrupts things. Paul tells us in Colossians, God has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his Son. That's not coexistence language, that's invasion language. The kingdom of God does not arrive passively, but it arrives definitively. And an invasion always provokes resistance. And what we discover that first Christmas night is that God's opening move is to send his Son, born of a virgin, born in a stable, born where no one else would take him in, to begin his move to redeem humanity. And here's the surprising part, though. Jesus doesn't say just endure persecution. He doesn't say just survive it. He says pretty clearly two things: rejoice and be glad. Not because suffering is good and not because pain is somehow holy, but because persecution will often locate us where our allegiance lies. If this is happening because of me, Jesus says, you're not lost, you're aligned. You're standing in a long line of people, not because you're failing, but because the kingdom is breaking in through you. And if there's resistance, it means that something might actually be happening that day. Christmas is the announcement that change has begun, not an abstract. And eventually crucify is God's answer to the world's brokenness. Because change doesn't happen through distance, but it happens through presence. It doesn't happen in commentary, but it happens in incarnation. And embodied change will always produce fruit. That's why the first response to the Christmas story is not neutrality. It's fear in the palaces, and it's found in joy throughout the fields. Because Christmas reveals this: God's kingdom threatens every false authority. God draws the religious elites or political authorities, but the overlooked, the people of history that we often forget about, unless God shows up in their life that night. And an angel appears to them and says, "Go and rejoice." Christmas is God's bypassing the centers of power and announcing a new reality from the margins. Not because the margins are morally superior, but because they're often honest in their life. They're not pretending to run the world because they know they have nothing to offer. This is Christmas is God saying this and demonstrating how his kingdom moves. Slowly, quietly, and often through ordinary people. Because the truth is, a child in a manger is not very impressive until you realize that everything else is about to become reorganized around him. And this is why Christmas always unsettles those who benefit from the way things are. Herod senses it immediately, Rome will feel it eventually, and the religious system will resist it consistently. Because once God draws near, neutrality is no longer an option. And while Christmas may be comforting, it's often seen more as confrontational, that things are here to change. It announces that God's not staying on the sidelines of human history anymore. He's stepping into it fully, vulnerably, and decisively. And if God is not staying distant, then the people who follow Jesus, we can't either. Christmas is not an invitation to sit on the sidelines and to observe. It's a summons to participate. If the kingdom has drawn near, then our lives cannot remain untouched. Faith cannot remain theoretical. Obedience cannot remain private. Allegiance cannot remain untested. Because Christmas reveals this: God's kingdom threatens every false authority. Because Christmas is the moment that disruption begins. The manger that night is not a pause in the conflict of the cosmic scale. It's the opening move of what God's willing to do to redeem and restore the world. And once God enters the world in this way, everything changes. And so if you're here today, I don't know where you're at, to be honest with all of this. Christmas may be, kind of the sweet little baby invitation this Christmas. No pressure or performing or pretending. One simple sentence. Choose allegiance over distance. That's it. That's it. And this is what it may look like this week. Name a place where you've kept Jesus safe and manageable. Practice visible faithfulness in ordinary places. Stay present. Obedience costs you something. Because as Jesus demonstrates, and as at first Christmas night, change never happens at a distance. God didn't shout salvation from heaven. He stepped into our mess. And to let you know something, he's still doing that each and every day. Oftentimes through ordinary people who refuse to keep him. Oftentimes through ordinary people who refuse to keep him safely contained. And so this Christmas,